Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Travis Talks. Today I'm going to be talking about some stuff that I think Riot needs to take into consideration and certain things that they should be looking at in 2016. LCS starts in just about a week or so, these are things that have been kind of on my mind for a little bit, and we can go ahead and dive into them. I do want to clarify, though, first that these are all going to be sort of things that I think Riot needs to look at, and when I say that, I mean, from the sort of North American LCS perspective, certainly a lot of these things can apply to other regions, but I'm not going to be really talking about stuff that Riot needs to fix or work on for China, Korea, other regions, even EU LCS necessarily. This is just, things that are on my mind coming from a guy who covers North American LCS. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about, and I've talked about this many times before, is that epic events deserve epic venues. This is something that I think Riot really failed to deliver on in 2015, especially from, again, a North American LCS perspective. But even, some of the international events or the best example is probably MSI. Everybody knows that I was very frustrated with the decision to host MSI in Tallahassee. It was an international event in a non-international city. I do not think that, and again, you can still create a good show in a lackluster venue or location, but I think that there's a great amount of feeling and emotion that just kind of gets added by the atmosphere of the location. A pretty good example of this in comparison to Tallahassee is when North American LCS finals were in Madison Square Garden. This obviously felt like a really good win for League of Legends and for esports because it was this historic sports location, sporting venue. It was in New York, this crazy international city. There were also all these awesome shots that the features team was able to get of the players and teams in New York in front of MSG. It just added this really fantastic emotional component. Another place where they failed on this was the All-Stars event at the end of the year in North American LCS Studios. It's kind of strange that you invite all these players to LA and then you stick them all in this tiny little venue. And I think they did a really good job of, dealing with what they had. I think that it was really cool that they had the extra seating outside, but when the rain started falling, and it was very funny, they tried to kind of play it off as this cool thing, but I just was like, what is this? This is a terrible situation. It's an international event. Please put it someplace really cool. Even if it's going to be in LA, there's a ton of venues that they could have secured. So I really hope that in the future, for the esport and for the public that, is interested in watching all this stuff, they're in really cool locations. Next up, I think that Riot really needs to take a look in 2016 at player salaries and player contracts. I've already done a video about how I feel as though player salaries should be public. Obviously, that sparked a lot of conversation. Who knows if that's even going to become a thing? Probably not. But I think that a lot of the points that I made in that video stand to a more broad situation, which is that players competing and players talking to managers and owners of teams often don't really have a good idea or a good sense of what their value is. They don't know what is inappropriate to have in a contract. They don't have a union or an agent that is backing them and helping make sure that they make good decisions. I really do hope that Riot takes a really close look at salaries and contracts, because right now, quite frankly, they're the only advocates that the players have. And while they're kind of in an awkward situation because they have this relationship and business agreement with the owners, again, they're the only people that can really help the players when the players end up in awkward situations. So hopefully 2016 they can go ahead and take a look at that a little bit more. Now, I don't know how many people have ever really talked about or thought about this next subject, and I will admit that I'm very biased in this because I have close personal friendships with a lot of these people, and also because they're kind of within the same area of the industry that I am, but I feel like Riot's talent needs to be treated like their actual talent. At the moment, they are, for the most part, just employees of Riot Games. My understanding is that they're under standard employment contracts rather than talent contracts. And I think that if you compare the situations that Riot talent, casters, and hosts and that kind of thing have in comparison to other esports, or even more broadly, traditional sports, you will find that there's a pretty big gap, right? So the benefits that Riot commentators and hosts and their talent have is that these guys get boosted a lot by the fact that Riot is putting them on their broadcast, right? Like it's arguably one of the best places that you can be in esports if you are a someone who does this talent work, right? Because there's so many viewers and there's such high production value, and they're going to work with you and make sure that you're really good and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, I feel like at the moment their talent is really under lock and key, which I feel is somewhat inappropriate given where we're at as an esport. So for instance, and some of you guys might know this because I think some of the commentators have said this, commentators and any of the Riot talent can't generate any revenue whenever they stream. And I think that also extends out to something like Gold Pretend. Like if Jat or somebody, Deficio, those guys have both done sort of team analysis and written interesting stuff, which evidently for some reason doesn't go on LawEsports.com. They're posting it on Twitlonger and their Facebook pages because they can't, have that go to the Score, GameSpot, any of these number of different places if any of those guys were interested in it. And they also can't put that on their own blog and monetize it. They also can't do any kind of sponsorship or endorsement of stuff. And while I understand that you don't really want these guys to necessarily be in a situation where they're endorsing Pepsi while the league is sponsored by Coke, I do think there are other opportunities for these guys to be able to explore out there, and I find that disappointing that they can't. You can compare this to someone like Monty or Doa, who actively cast OGN but can do all sorts of other things. I mean, Monty literally owns a team, right? And I think that unless Riot really changes this, they're going to have a hard time attracting very, very good talent, which they're going to need going forward because they're going to be expanding the leagues to more games and that kind of thing. Certainly you'll need more talent for that. And I think that there's a risk of losing talent. I mean, certainly we saw Joe and D-Man go. Now D-Man has said that he kind of wishes he hadn't made that decision, but going forward, I think that there's going to be a lot more opportunities in esports for these guys, and unless Riot frees them up a little bit, I would be concerned about losing some of them. Next up, I think that Riot really needs to look at the way that they're communicating with the public and the esports community and figure out better ways to do that. Because right now, if you think about it, most of their announcements and updates and that kind of thing basically get thrown out like proclamations onto lawesports.com, where suddenly something goes up on lawesports.com. Oftentimes it's very limited in the scope of what their explanation is or whatever. The best example I can think of this is when they talked about the format changes, especially around best of 3 and best of 2 being in the 2 different regions, right? NA getting best of 3, EU getting best of 2. I think the explanation for that was only like a couple sentences long, and that was kind of it, right? That's crazy to me because as somebody who's been a part of this community for so long and part of the industry, if you told me ahead of time like this was going to happen, I would say, all right, well, the very first thing everybody's going to be asking is why is this so different between the 2 regions? Because generally speaking, the goal has always appeared to get them in sync and sort of treat them equally, as it were. And so my feeling is that you would want to have a very lengthy conversation around why you're doing that. The conversation they put out was basically like, oh yeah, like this is a little bit different in these 2 different regions, and so for traditional sports, so we're just going to do it here. Seems like a huge failing, right? Beyond that, again, you only ever really get these articles. Every now and then you see some people tweet or post on Reddit to explain it. I guess occasionally there's been some AMAs, and that's been quite nice, but even as a journalist, and also seeing other journalists reach out to Riot for comment on a lot of things. They won't give a comment, and then once a story gets published, they just comment in the Reddit thread for it, and by then it's already too late, which I think is a disservice not only to the public and the community, but also to themselves, right? Like, you probably want to get out ahead of a lot of the conversations that some of these breaking news stories create and provide journalists at the very least with your side of the story beforehand, rather than trying to clean up after everything has gotten kind of crazy. So I just don't really understand the strategy there right now, and I think that there's a lot of opportunities for them to do that better. Finally, and maybe if I was actually ranking all these, I might actually make this number 1 because I think it's such a big deal. But Riot needs to look a lot closer at the game that they're creating and figure out how to upgrade it for the sport. And when I say that, I mean literally sometimes engineering features. I think that this is something that Valve has done very well in terms of creating features, replays, all sorts of options and APIs for people to grab into and really interact with both CSGO and Dota 2. And I think that time and time again, we've seen people in the esports community sort of say like, hey, this is maybe a bad situation. We need sandbox mode so that teams can get better, or we want to run a different style of drafting in esports, or we want replays so that we can study the stuff or see how this stuff works behind the scenes. And Riot has mostly just failed to deliver on this, citing the fact that these are not necessarily easy things to implement and that there are maybe better things for them to focus on. And I understand the idea that like esports is only a small part of the broad pool, but if you are serious about esports, which I think you are because you've built this giant, esports department and you're running all these huge events, you should also support it from the game side too. And at the moment, I don't really see that. In fact, I'm going to release soon probably a video just talking about how I feel like the spectator UI is pretty dated and not that great. And there's a million easy ways to upgrade it. So I really do hope that in 2016 we see Riot take a closer look at the actual game of League of Legends and the features that are a part of it and figure out ways to upgrade that with the esport in mind. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed the video. You can check out more coverage leading up to the LCS starting and including LCS coverage very soon at gamespot.com/LOL.